I'm really excited to be chairing this event today with our speakers, who I'll introduce shortly. But just to start off with, this is a public talk that's part of a week-long convention for Hub members that looks at methods, creativity, and innovation. We hope that throughout the presentations that you'll drop your questions in the chat box, and then we can get to those at the end. So for those of you who don't know, the Gender Justice and Security Hub was a multi-partner research network working with local and global civil society, practitioners, governments, and international organizations to advance gender justice and inclusive peace. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, Canada, and I would just like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land today. All right, and now I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we can get started. So Dr. Mohamed Sese is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Science at York University and a UKRI visiting fellow at the LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security, where he's affiliated as a co-investigator and researcher in the Gender Justice and Security Hub. His research interests are in transitional justice, international criminal justice, rule of law, customary justice, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. On the Hub, Mohamed, with Simeon Koroma, Time Out for Justice, is undertaking a comparative study on land policy, gender justice, and plural legal systems in Sierra Leone and Uganda. Simeon Koroma is the founder of Time Out for Justice, a community-based organization in Sierra Leone that provides legal aid and other justice services, including support of communities, especially women's rights to legally own, access, and utilize land. Simeon is a leading advocate of meaningful community involvement in agriculture and mining concession agreements. He spearheaded the campaign for the formal recognition of paralegals and the establishment of a legal aid board in Sierra Leone. He is presently a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, where his research focuses on the experience of improvised law and community disputing processes. Dr. Patricia Abdullahi is a lecturer in sustainable development at the University of Makeni and a research associate at Time Out for Justice, working on land policy, gender justice, and legal pluralism in Sierra Leone. Dr. Abdullahi's research focuses on the socioeconomic effects of poverty in rural livelihoods, environmental sustainability, and water resources engineering. She was a researcher at the Water Resource System Laboratory at Seoul National University of Science and Technology, South Korea, where she obtained her PhD in 2019. Anthony Mansoure holds a Master's in Science in Global Health and Development from the University College London, with over 10 years of progressive professional experience in developing and overseeing research, monitoring, evaluation, and accountability systems. Anthony's research covers health, education, justice, social protection, governance, emergency resource, and livelihood sectors. He has co-authored 4 peer-reviewed research publications and now works as a research assistant at Time Out for Justice in Sierra Leone. So with that, I'll pass it over to the speakers and we can get started. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the introduction, Claire, and welcome everybody to our panel. We really appreciate you sharing this time with us. We're going to do a presentation on a topic we titled COVID-19 and the land policy in Sierra Leone, gender justice and livelihood implications. So we're going to do the presentation as a team. I'm going to do the first segment, and my colleagues who have been introduced would speak after my own segment. So we have a roadmap for you. So what we want to try to do is to first present you with what we call the historical, political, and legal context in which we are trying to situate not just this talk, but our project more broadly. And myself and Simeon will speak to that. And after our presentation, we will have one of our colleagues, Dr. Lahai, to do a presentation on the sort of impact or implications for gender justice and women's rights within this context. And then Anthony would say something about how we are connecting what we are trying to do in our project to these issues and the context we would be talking about earlier. And then lastly, Simeon and I will come back and try to tie everything together, trying to link our project to perhaps the change in circumstances related to COVID-19. So on my part, I'm going to pretend to be the historian on the panel. And I think I'm going to be very bad at that because I'm trying to summarize a very rich and long history of Sierra Leone into about a 15-minute presentation. So bear with me. So what I'm going to try to do is to divide the history that we think is relevant to our project into segments or into periods. I think the first place to start is what we call the colonial history of Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, as some of you may be aware, is a former British colony. And that means that for a very long period of time, it was under the rule of the British Empire. But for us, what is really important is that rule was divided into two. So Sierra Leone was administered first as a British colony, and that started in 1808. What was the British colony is now Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone. And then there was the protectorate, which we call provinces today. But here is what is important in this distinction. The colony was governed under British rule by a form of a direct administration, while the protectorate was administered by what is known as colonial indirect rule. This is really key for our research, because under indirect rule, it meant that the colonial administration in a way maintained pre-existing traditional authorities and structures in the interior, and they were able to use those structures to maintain control of the protectorate of Sierra Leone. If you look at what that means for us today, or governance in Sierra Leone today, is that there is a real situation of duality. Duality in terms of governance, duality in terms of law, which Simeon, who is our lawyer on this panel, will be speaking to. But let me just speak briefly to duality in terms of land tenure. What this means is that even though we have one country, we have two systems of land tenure. In the western area where Freetown is located, there is a freehold tenure system that is based on the liberal principle of individualism, which means you can buy and sell land as any commodity on the market. When you move outside the western area, when you get to the provinces, which was the protectorate, the land tenure system is based on customary law, and it is called a communal system governed by a myriad of customary rules. So it means that the rules you have to play by to get access to land in Freetown is different from the one that exists in the provinces. What this also means is that in the provinces, particularly for women, which our colleague will be speaking to, for them to get access to land or for them to exercise their property right, they have to go through often a male relative, because in many parts of the provinces, there are patriarchal structures which colonialism consolidated instead of undermined and have continued to exist today. One other thing that I might want to talk about in terms of this legacy of duality is that in Sierra Leone, there are some people, depending on where they find themselves, that are considered to be indigenes, while others are considered to be strangers. Here is one example. When the colony was established in Freetown, the main residents were Creoles. These are descendants of former slaves after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. If you are a Creole and you move to the provinces, you are considered to be a stranger. It means you have a different access to land. So for instance, you will not be able to own land in that part of the country. So there's that indigenous stranger dynamic that is real today that we want to situate our project within. Let's fast forward to the post-colonial era. And here I'm going to talk about the period between 1961, when Sierra Leone gained formal independence from British rule, to 1996, when we will say that the country experienced its first post-colonial democratic election. Here are some few important things that had happened during this period. Sierra Leone is one of those African countries where independence did not mean a complete break from colonial governance systems or colonial governance structures. If anything, what we saw in Sierra Leone is a lot of continuation of colonial rule, particularly indirect rule. It meant that the post-colonial debate about land was largely about the unequal property rights and access that were inherited from colonial rule. So for instance, the Creoles in Freetown, they kept complaining that this is unfair. If you are coming from the province and you are in the western area, you can buy land. You can get easy access to land. But when we go to the protectorate or to the provinces, we are denied the same access. Another part of the conversation related to the land question in the post-colonial era has to do with the kind of hindrances or the kinds of obstacles that people who wanted to invest in land in the rural areas were to put up with. So for instance, if you want to invest in the rural economy and you want access to land, you have to play by customary rules, which are not always market friendly. Of course, one of the ways that politicians and policymakers have been able to get around this, and probably Simeon will speak to this, is what is known as a leasehold system. So they will allow you to lease the land in the rural areas for a very long period of time, but you cannot own the land as you will own a property on the market. One last thing I want to say about this period, you may be asking yourself, this is very not in alignment with economic development, right? With the liberalization of the economy. Then why is it that this duality has been sustained during this period? My answer to that question is simply that it is political, right? In Sierra Leone, for you to gain power and to maintain power, you need to construct what is known as a central local elite alliance. Another way to put it is you need an alliance between the traditional and the modern elite. Often, for you to forge that alliance, you have to make a compromise. And one of the compromises that have been made since colonial rule is to maintain the power and authority of the traditional rulers over land. So for instance, to date, they are the custodians of customary or communal land. It is very difficult for you to reform that arrangement, because when you take that power from them, they are losing something. And politicians in Freetown, they want the votes in the rural areas, right? They want access to the rural area. So it's like that's what they give. They maintain the power of traditional authorities over land in exchange for their access to rural communities, rural resources, and the vote. So in my view, and that's the politics that has sustained this duality since the end of colonial rule. Let me move quickly to another important period in the history of Sierra Leone. As many of you would know, Sierra Leone is one of those countries in Africa where post-colonial bad governance degenerated into a brutal, devastating civil war that lasted for up to 11 years from 1991 to 2002. Few things that I might want to say about this period. Clearly, Even though there is a disagreement about the causes of war, I have never read any account that relates the cause of war in Sierra Leone to land dispute. It was not about land, right? But in a way, there are indirect connection to land. If you are looking at the conduct of the conflict, its duration, and things like that. And I'm going to speak briefly to two elements of this. The first is what the agrarian rebellion literature by Paul Richards and others try to cover. And according to their anthropological investigation, they've been able to find that land grievances, particularly in the rural area, was fed into the armed conflict. So for instance, when traditional rulers, chiefs, elders, and other big men in the rural areas, when they abused their authorities and they denied young people access to land, these young people came back during the conflict to settle scores, right? And also among those who were denied access to land during this period were women groups, right? So some have argued that that part of the underlying grievances that fed into the conflict. Another way to talk about the connection between land and the war is what I call conflict resource. So of course, I know most of you have heard about diamonds. Yeah, we have diamonds in Sierra Leone. And it was part of, one would argue, what led to the long duration of the conflict. But of course, diamonds and other minerals, they are hosted in land. In fact, that accounts for why the areas of the country where the war was the fiercest are the areas where you have diamonds. So like a district like Colonial, which have diamonds, it was a battle for control of those areas. Two other things that was going on during this period that has received very few or very little attention. One is that during this period, there is what I call a deterioration of traditional authorities and traditional rules over land, over access to land. And I think it has created a conflict over land during this period and to date. But also in the Western area, particularly Freetown, there is what I call war-induced migration. Because of the conflict, there has been a massive influx of people from the rural areas to Freetown. If you look at the map of Sierra Leone, Freetown is a very small area, which was the colony. Now, what we are now seeing is that there is a growing population which the land cannot sustain. So the situation in Freetown is one in which we are witnessing recently a lot of environmental problems related to landslide, floods, and things like that. But in addition, there is what I call a breakdown of land governance in Freetown. So for instance, the ministries, the departments that are responsible for land management, land governance, they simply do not have the capacity to do so. They are riddled with corruption, with bad practices, bad policies that I am afraid to say has made land management in Freetown very chaotic. And of course, women are caught in this problem, right? In their ability to be able to access land, even in Freetown.
Sorry, Mohammed, just to jump in, if you could wrap up in about 1 minute, that would be great.
Sure. Yes, I'm definitely going to wrap this up in 1 minute. So I'm going to talk briefly about the post-war economic boom. So after the war in Sierra Leone, there was also the question of land, but for a reason that is completely different from the ones that I have talked about, which is about economic recovery. Most of the economic recovery programs in Sierra Leone were about giving access to land to foreign direct investment. The point that I want to make here is that it's conflicted in a way. There was a tension between that goal and the goal of justice reform, where you will have the rights of women being paid attention to, which Simeon is going to talk about. And we see that tension to date. How do you manage interest in economic development and the rights of women or the rights of vulnerable group? And it's something that we're going to come back to in our project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I can turn it over to Simeon, I believe.
Thank you, Mohammed. So if you can just help me with the slides as well. Yeah, so thank you very much. So just building on Mohammed's presentation, Sierra Leone's historical development, including its colonial legacy, meant that in the administration of justice, two parallel systems were created. Now, one each for the colony, which now is called the Western area, and one for the protectorate, which now is called the provinces. Now, the judicial structure that emanated from this engagement reinforced the divisions and laid the foundation for today's Sierra Leone. Now, just to give an example, the Protectorate Ordinance of 1896 at the time carved out a judicial structure for the provinces, which meant that there was the creation of what was called the courts of native chiefs. These courts were made up entirely by paramount chiefs. Now, what was interesting then, and probably still important today, is those courts had exclusive jurisdiction on all customary matters, including the determination of title to land. Now, why is this important? This is because, the Western area, if you just recall the map you saw at the beginning of Mohammed's presentation, Western area makes up less than 2% of the land size of Sierra Leone. It's a really tiny space. Now, the provinces, the rest of the country, which is almost about 98%, title to land in that part of Sierra Leone is in the exclusive domain of customary law. Now, I'll come back to that later. At the opposite end of the protectorate or the provinces, you have, as Mohammed mentioned, the colony of Sierra Leone, the Western area where Freetown, the capital city, is located. Now, this territory was governed exclusively in accordance with English law. Now, because it was a settler location for freed slaves, there was never an intention to treat it as the rest of the country. So I'll give one example. As early as 1881, a legislation was passed in the UK Parliament and then, and then brought to Sierra Leone, called the Supreme Court of Sierra Leone Act of 1881. Now, it said, and I'll probably cite just the relevant parts, and I quote, "The statutes of general application which were in force in England on the first day of January 1880 would apply in the colony." Now, why is that legislation important? It's important because although changes were made in the course of more than 150 years of colonial rule in Sierra Leone, such as the introduction of a leaner legal structure, as you would see on the right-hand side, yet the basic architecture of our legal system remained the same. So the legislation I just mentioned was exported and is still part of Sierra Leone's law today. Now, what's the consequence of this? So to understand, next slide, please. So to understand the incongruity of applying legal dualism even after independence, you would only need to look at the impact on land law or property law in Sierra Leone. What this means is that there are different laws that apply to the Western area, where the capital city is located, and the provinces, with different rules of acquisition of property, ownership of property, other rights in land. And so all of these different rules create additional hardships for certain categories of the population, including women, particularly women, actually. So for fear of boring you with the details, I should just state, for example, that there were a raft of legislations promulgated during the colonial era. So here I'll probably just mention two. So you have the Protectorate Lands Ordinance, and you have the Public Lands Ordinance to apply in both the provinces and the Western area, respectively. Now, these two legislations are the primary foundations of, I guess, land law in Sierra Leone. And they were set up during the colonial era, and they still exist today without much movement in terms of amendments or even repeal. So what's the legal effect of this? The legal effect, next slide, please, means that, in practice, there is what we call two specific categories of tenurial rights, right? So in the Western area, you have individual land tenure. And because you have individual land tenure, it would be much like you would find in England or in Wales or in other Commonwealth countries, where if you have a dispute in relation to land, you'll go to the courts. So that's the system that you find in the Western area, in the 2% land area of Sierra Leone. Now, the problem with this, though, is that, like I said, it's only 2% of the land. So which means for the majority of the land in the country, the rules that exist are customary rules. And for those who are, scholars of customary law, you would know how dynamic it is and how it changes, right? And how it favors men, etc. So this raises many political, economic, developmental questions, many of which, Mohammed has mentioned. But, they also create a huge impact on how women are able to access land or acquire it or, benefit from land. And I would provide two short cases, shortly, to give you an example of how organizations like Team Up for Justice that I work for have been dealing with, issues relating to land, especially land rights for women. So customary law, for example, is very clear about who strangers are and who indigents are when it comes to land distribution or land benefits. Because of this confusion or the state of affairs with different laws applying in separate regions and different layers of institutions, what this does is it brings with it huge challenges, but we think, it also has huge opportunities. And we'll talk about the opportunities, towards the end of this presentation. But for a start, in terms of the adjudicatory processes in the event of disputes or claims, if you are in the provinces and not in the Western area where you can only go to courts, you seem to have, I guess, two ways to proceed. So you have the official path, and the official path would mean you would go to the local courts. If you recall the chief's courts I mentioned, so in colonial times, they were the chief's courts, now they are local courts. Now, these courts, lawyers can't appear before, so they are made up of elders. To put it into perspective, about 4 years ago, there were 287 of these courts across the country. These courts are presided over by chairmen, okay, they call chairmen, local court chairmen. Of these 287, there was only one female chairperson of the 287. And this does not inspire much, I guess, encouragement for women litigants, you would all imagine. So one last point on this in terms of the customary law. Despite the crucial role customary law plays in land, there is still some space because, based on the repugnancy clauses, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, customary law can be subject to statutory law. However, and this is a really big knockout in Sierra Leone, the Constitution of Sierra Leone does not consider discrimination based on custom as discrimination under the rights to equality and I don't know if it makes sense. So when it comes to discrimination, you can't say, well, you're treating women badly. If it's under customary law, the treatment of women, it's negative treatment of women is under customary law, then it cannot be considered as discrimination under the Constitution of Sierra Leone. So this is why it's been very hard for human rights advocates or even litigation to get past many of this. What this does is, so this leaves, as a result, many litigants to go to use the informal or unofficial channels to get their disputes resolved in the provinces. Now, one such example will be to go to traditional leaders or go to secret societies. But many of them are men, and these are like male-dominated, societies, and environments. But the other options would be going to NGOs, such as Team Up for Justice. So there are many NGOs that have emerged, who straddle both the formal and customary institutions to search for just outcomes for women. So, just to go quickly to the two stories I mentioned. So these were real cases that were admitted by TMAP. So the first one, Yankade lost her husband to the Ebola pandemic in Sierra Leone in 2015. I mean, this husband was taken to the eastern part of Sierra Leone and never returned because that was where the main hospital was. Now, they had a house and a farm, but upon his death, his family claimed both the house and the farm. She was allowed to continue to benefit from both, only if she remained in the village. So she could not sell the house, or she could not get the proceeds if she decided to rent the house. Now, she came to the TMAP office and we helped her to bring a case at the local court, which is the only place you can go anyway, and lawyers don't go to that court. So we helped her to go there. We lost the case because the court said both the land and the farm were family land. They were not individual land that the husband owned. This land was owned by the family. We appealed to the district appeal court where lawyers could apply. I was there, appealing, on behalf of this woman. We lost again, based on the same facts. Now, second case, Fatu was a member of a land-owning family in McKinney that had leased their land to a multinational corporation. She was not one of the lessors and therefore did not receive any of the proceeds. I mean, the excuse from the family was she was a woman who would marry soon, so she should go and claim her husband's property. Now, we didn't go to court this time. We went to the local authorities, to the paramount chief, and then we went to the company directly. First, we appealed, for a recognition of her rights, and then threatened to void the lease if that wasn't complied with. Fortunately, the lease was amended accordingly, and she benefited. Now, just on my last slide, what does this then mean? So I'd like to push a bit more like positive spin to all of this. Now, there have been a lot of, based on where we are now, a lot of changes haven't really taken place because we still have all these colonial rules. And I guess one key way to put it is for those people who were schooled in British common law, for example, Sierra Leone is still in the pre-1925 land law status. And you can just think about it and all the reforms England has passed since then. So as a result of this stagnation, we still have opportunities. And I guess I want to talk about just two legislations. One, the Registration of Customary Marriage and Divorce Act and the Devolution of Estates Act. With the first one, the Registration of Customary Marriage and Divorce Act, this has nothing to do with land directly, but it recognizes customary marriages. So by recognizing customary marriages and raising their status to the level of Mohammedan, Christian, and civil marriages, what this has done is that it has helped organizations like TMAP and other NGOs to be able to secure the rights of married women under customary law. About 95% of marriages in Sierra Leone are customary marriages, although the vast majority of them continue to become also Christian marriages or Mohammedan marriages and civil marriages. So this is a really great way for us to work. The final one is the Devolution of Estates Act. Now, it allows widows to inherit land in the event of intestacy, like in my example of Yakade. But the criticism of it is it only relates to individual land tenure. So if you're in the Western area, it works fine for you because land there is individual tenure. If you're in the provinces where 98% of the land is, it doesn't work for you like Yankade, right? So if the land is family land or communal land, then this law would not apply, which means you would have to fall under customary law. So finally, this brings us to the current situation, the land policy. It attempts to marry all the different issues highlighted so far, including legal dualism, different tenures, as a way for government to address the land injustices. But what this does for us, and for this project in particular, is to look at the opportunities that present themselves. So my colleague, Dr. Abdullahi, whom I'm sure is now on, will talk about what all of this really mean for the present situation of women in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simeon. That was fascinating, and thanks also for sticking exactly to time. So we're very happy now that Dr. Patricia Abdullahi has been able to join us. So I'll hand it over to her.
I'll be talking about gender justice and women's rights in Sierra Leone. And this has been a growing concern over the years, especially in Sierra Leone. The next slide, please. Women's land rights in Sierra Leone has been a growing concern over the years. I'll give some statistics based on this. Poverty has been a trending problem in the country today for women, especially for land rights. There is a report on the multidimensional index of poverty of 2019, and this report estimates that about 86.3% of people in rural areas are higher in terms of poverty than those in urban areas, which is just like 37.6%. And the intensity of this poverty in rural to urban areas is like 10 times more than the urban areas, as you can see from the statistics. And these statistics results have been a growing concern over the years, as women have little access or entitlement to land and other resources. In terms of female to male gender, in terms of land rights, you find out that even in these statistics, the intensity of poverty between male and female is higher in female when you consider the male counterpart. From this, you can see that poverty is one of the key fights towards access to women's right land in Sierra Leone.
Sorry, it looks like we might have lost Patricia there. Let's just try to see if we can get her back online.
I think she's just accidentally muted.
Patricia, I think you've muted yourself.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, sorry. And in terms of female-headed household in Sierra Leone, you can see that poverty rate is higher in female-headed household than male household. When you consider also the reports given by the Multidimensional Poverty Index for 2017, you can see that for male and female households in Sierra Leone, the rate of poverty is very, very high. So you can see how disadvantaged women have been for many years in terms of access to land rights in Sierra Leone. And then we can look at the challenges. Next slide, please. We can look at some of these challenges which women are facing in terms of land rights. They have the lack of strong legal framework that supports women's land ownership, and to implement these laws also for both rural and urban areas. You can see that in terms of rural areas, there are no laws which can help these female who own land to improve their standard of living. You find out that female-headed households, they lack the ability to fight their rights towards land issues. And some of these women are also sidelined in terms of negotiations and agreements. There is a situation in one village in the northern province of Sierra Leone with one lady, just an example, called Yamari. Yamari used to farm this land in the village in the northern region to support her own family. And even though the male counterpart in the village knows that Yamari owned the land, but she does not have no legal title to the land. And there was a general understanding with the male relative that she owned the land. So she was cultivating it. After 4 years, the Swiss bioenergy company named Adax Bioenergy, they came to Yamari's region. Her male relatives leased the farmland to the company without her own consent. And she was excluded from all the negotiations and even refused to give her a share of this payment. Yamari's flight in this case is not an isolated case in Sierra Leone. There are a lot of women in Sierra Leone who are facing this disposition of land in terms of ownership. and in the wake of what large-scale land acquisition in terms of acquiring land in their village. These are some of these challenges. There are also challenges like customary and what statutory laws, which does not allow female to own a land in Sierra Leone, especially in the rural areas. In the urban areas, it's kind of a little bit a different thing. They can pursue their case toward the legal system. And so there are some organizations in the urban areas who help them to fight some of these cases which they are facing in the country. But in terms of the rural areas, it's completely a different case because what these laws are not being implemented at the local level, especially in the rural areas. So you see how disadvantaged people and women in the rural areas have been in terms of land rights, considering and those who live in the urban areas who can pursue at least their case to the legal system by following some organization, example like this one, Tina for Justice, who can stand for them towards their land rights. And land grabbing is also a contributing factor to women's land rights in Sierra Leone. You find out that through this process, a lot of women have undergo sexual violence, discrimination from their male counterparts because they lack the capacity, the ability, the knowledge, education and still to pursue their case, especially those who are living in rural areas, which is a little bit of a different case for those in the urban areas who can go through the legal system, to organizations who can help them fight this case. So these are some of the challenges women face in terms of access to land rights in Sierra Leone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was really interesting. And now let's pass it over to our final speaker, and then we can open it up for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think we've heard a lot about the historical context, the legal framework, and of course, how that sits within overall gender justice and access to land for women in Sierra Leone. What's next? So now I'm going to talk about our project, like what are we doing to address some of these challenges or the specific context my colleagues have spoken about. So it's actually a twofold kind of approach we want to do here. One is we want to be able to do some form of research that will inform policy or inform a general kind of discourse around land rights and gender justice in Sierra Leone. But also the next approach we want to use is come up with some innovative ideas that could be able to address the situation in general. So what's the rationale of the research? We want to be able to examine the impact of contemporary land policy on gender justice in general. We also want to focus specifically on the tenural insecurity of women and the structures and practices that shape women's land rights and experiences. Of course, we also want to explore colonial and post-colonial legal developments, armed conflicts, and post-war reconstruction, and how that has shaped the contemporary policy debates and positions on general practices on the ground. A few methods we want to explore. I think one of my colleagues earlier on mentioned that a similar kind of project has been run in Uganda, and banking on the historical context and the similarity of the historical context between Sierra Leone and Uganda, and of course, some other indicators that show similarity. We want to be able to do some qualitative approach in which we can collect a combination of field data through focus group, through in-depth interviews that are semi-structured, key informant interviews, desk reviews, and document analysis, looking into policies around land rights. And of course, we also want to do some in-depth analysis of these documents to compare some of the policies across the two countries and see how that shapes women's land rights and experiences in general. In terms of targeting, we are thinking of targeting mostly NGOs within the sector, of course, individuals who are affected by land rights, and groups of women who are also affected by land rights, land policy, and access to land. At district and regional levels, we also want to target customary and indigenous and traditional authorities, corporate actors, civil society organizations, NGOs, and agencies within the sector. And this is all going to be done working closely with Team Up for Justice, and of course, women and women's groups across the country in specific districts. We also have thought of using some innovative kind of ideas to see how some of the findings from the research can be turned into tangibles that could help in the discourse for land rights, but also engage policymakers and local authorities and CSOs and NGOs within the sector. So through Team Up for Justice, we'll be engaging local CSOs and NGOs through workshops, roundtable discussions, and of course, quarterly and gender justice updates through newsletters, educational materials that could actually be able to inform and engage policymakers and local stakeholders. The team here also has some close relationships and connections with SDG focal person in Sierra Leone, Dr. Shaka Bangura, who's been leading efforts to make the country a pathfinder for just and inclusive society for all, and particularly for women. Our dissemination and knowledge sharing efforts will engage local communities, as I've mentioned. We'll also use other means of dialogue at the community level through village shows, dramas, cultural performances, which has been some of the tools that have proven to have been very effective in engaging communities in Sierra Leone in the past. And of course, media engagement is going to be one of the strategies we want to also utilize, which will include radio jingles, discussions, soap operas, of course, on the radio that produces some dramatic messages that will help communities and women and other groups properly understand what the policy debate is and what the issues are around gender justice and rights and access to women to land. Within the academic community, of course, we are thinking there will be a few publications, but at the local level, we want to be able to also engage local academics, students, through student debate series and panel discussions at local universities across the country. So those are some of the major approaches we are thinking about as part of our interventions and research efforts.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It sounds like a fascinating project, and I'm so excited to see how it evolves. I'm going to hand it back over to Mohammed now, just to wrap up, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Claire. Actually, it's myself and Simeon who will wrap things up. I know many of you may be wondering that we have COVID-19 in our title of the talk. And so far, we've not said anything about that. We have 2 slides for you. So what we're going to try to wrap up with is how does COVID relates to our project and what we're trying to do in Sierra Leone. I'm going to speak to what we think are the concerns that COVID may have highlighted in Sierra Leone, because we believe, of course, there are very few studies on these issues. I think in Sierra Leone, the only report we got recently was by a group which is called the Sierra Leone Land Alliance. It's a small group, and they came out with a very small report to look at the issues of land that have been influenced or shaped by the COVID situation in Sierra Leone. But broadly, we think that with COVID, particularly in terms of its aftermath, the recovery, it would bring back to the fore the use of land for economic recovery. Even though Sierra Leone has been largely spared of the sort of grave public health crisis that other parts of the world are confronting. We think that the economic fallout of this pandemic would mean that government will be under immense pressure to utilize land to pay for the economic recovery in the country. And of course, we all know, based on our talk, that that has some serious implications for protecting the rights of women, gender justice as it relates to land. Because again, it is this tension between economic recovery and justice in let's say, in the post-COVID era. We also think that now that there is COVID in Sierra Leone in some way, it may have loosened the protection that communities have been able to get, which organizations like Team Up for Justice have been trying to sort of build, because in fact now with some restrictions, it is very difficult for communities to participate in negotiations in terms of giving leases of land to people, in terms of what transnational companies are doing in the country. I think it's going to, in a way, narrow that space for community consent and community participation in negotiation processes relating to land. But we also think that generally at the local level, we are going to see an increased commercialization of land, particularly when people are trying to deal with the economic hardship that is linked to COVID. I think there will be a lot of tension, particularly, for instance, when people want to sell a family land, or when people want to sort of convert something that is communally owned to something that they could dispose of on the market. And of course, women are going to be caught up in this. And lastly, another concern is that we think that with COVID, and the attention of government to certain priorities, particularly economic development, it will widen the gap between policies that are fine on paper, some of them Simeon has already spoken about, and the everyday realities of women on the ground in terms of their struggle to access land and property rights. So these are the concerns we think that COVID has brought to the fore. But of course, our project is going to sort of shed more light on this. But I think there is also some hope that COVID may have sort of brought to the fore. And Simeon is going to speak on that and then wrap up.
Yes. Thank you, Mohamed. So in terms of hope, what I can say is, after Ebola in 2015, and that's the closest we can draw on in terms of comparison. So after Ebola in 2015, there was the land policy. And for people who haven't seen that, the land policy is your dream document. It's the boldest and probably most ambitious land reform agenda ever in the history of Sierra Leone. It has all the protections you can dream of and all the different things you would really want. Now, post-COVID-19, we think there will be even more reasons to either implement the land policy or revise it. Either way, it will provide a huge opportunity for everyone in Sierra Leone. And this is where we think there are opportunities for our project, because our project is coming in at a time when all of these issues are at a flux stage where they can be changed, they can be influenced. And so we look at the legislative agenda that could come in. We look at policy changes that the land policy makes possible. But then more importantly, we look at the connections that we can build under this project. And here I'm talking specifically about connections we are creating and those we have created through our partnerships with community leaders, with community-based groups. This includes women's associations, women's groups, civil society heads, people at the government level, including policymakers. So we think those associations, those connections, which this project is making and will continue to make, will provide the basis for the opportunities I'm talking about and the opportunities Mohamed also mentioned, so that in a way this project will be in a situation where by 2023, 2024, when we're really wrapping it up, to have something really concrete to be able to show. So it's not all doom. So we really hope, we're looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for wrapping that up so well, Simeon and Mohammed. And thanks to all of the panelists. This was fascinating, and I learned a lot. So we're going to start with the Q&A, and I'm going to use my my chair privileges to ask a question first, and then we'll go through the list. Everybody, please continue to put your questions on the chat, and hopefully we have time to get to everyone's. So I think this is maybe a question for Simeon, but for any of the panelists that have experience of this, I thought it was really interesting how you laid out the landscape of the legal pluralist situation in Sierra Leone and these tensions between the formal and customary systems. And I'm really interested in those points of friction between formal and so-called informal systems, because when you hear a lot of transitional justice practitioners talk, sometimes there can be this characterization of the local that's kind of pure and good and an alternative to formality, and whereas in other places, there's a desire to get justice processes into the formal. I work on justice reform policies previously to this in Canada, and I had a funny interaction between justice officials in Canada who were saying, oh, for justice for women, we really need to bring it to the level of the local, as though power dynamics that don't exist in the formal system somehow wither away at the level of the local. And then having a conversation with a colleague in Pakistan who was saying, no, we really need to take gender justice and put it right into the formal system. And, for the reasons of local power dynamics being the perceived problem there. And so I was wondering, in your work, do you ever see examples of where women or people who are trying to access land justice or other kinds of justice using these friction points between the formal and the customary to sort of pursue different kinds of political goals or justice goals? So if you have any examples of that you've seen in your work, I'd be really interested to hear about that. I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll go through the other questions that we have in the chat, and then you guys can sort of think about which questions speak best to your own experiences and speak to that. So going to the top here, we have a question from Caitlin Ryan, who asks a question that's maybe more about your subjective opinions, but she's wondering if you have any thoughts about what the replacement of Sandy as the Minister of Lands might mean for implementing the NLP, and if you think that there's any chance that having a new minister might encourage some more momentum to legislate the plan in Parliament, or for the ministry to be more proactive in implementing the parts of the plan that don't require more legislation. And then we have a question from Laura Martin from Sheffield, who says that you mentioned COVID, but I was wondering if there's any evidence from the Ebola recovery that can be drawn upon for what the relationship between gender, land, and justice will mean, and whether there are implications for the 2019 gender amendments. So maybe we'll keep it with those three questions and then give you guys a chance to respond, and then move on to more questions, if that sounds okay.
Great. So maybe let me go first and talk about your question. So yeah, I mean it's you laid it out, I guess, really well in terms of this the friction, right? So what I would say is what I've seen in our work, and I'm talking about 18 years of progressive work in this field, is you have a legal system. You basically have like you have a system that's there, and people learn to use the system and then learn to actually take advantage of the system. So you can look at the purity side, where you would say, look, there are certainly certain aspects of a recourse to, say, a solution, whether it's legal or social, whatever the solution is, that makes sense to go through the customary system or the non-formal system, right? But there are times when, clearly the customary system would not work for the many reasons we've mentioned including the power dynamics, including this domination of men, including women finding no spaces to really be able to do anything, right? So then it would make sense to go to the formal. There were several examples, and I can just put them, I can just say in one sentence that what we have tried to do and what we see people doing is they use the systems against each other. So you use the formal system against the customary because of the repugnancy clause, right? So if the customary law goes against formal law, then the customary law is void, right? So people use that against the customary law, but you can also use both to build bridges. So, so how do people use them? In my two examples I gave in those two stories, you can see where sometimes the law doesn't give you space to use the formal. You just have to use the local, the customary, in this sense, the local courts for title to land, right? So you don't have anywhere to go, you have no legal room. But where you have both, like in a negotiation with a corporation directly, we were able to use a customary setting to appeal, but then use the formal law to threaten, right? So the combination of both allowed us to get the solution. So I guess what I would say is, I don't know, personally, I don't know which system is preferable. And I've seen people in their circumstances use both or use either depending on what they want to do. And I don't know what is good for Sierra Leone, whether we should say, formalize everything or, put everything into a statute. I don't know if that would be the solution. But I would say, people are learning to use both systems to their advantage. And that's where, unfortunately, I'm seeing things going.
No, I mean, that makes so much sense. And I think that work that your organization is doing in terms of sort of acting as an interlocutor between these different systems and helping people navigate is fascinating, and also a sort of alternative to this binary form of thinking of you need formal or you need informal. It's amazing to see people sort of navigating those spaces and the productive things that can come out of that too. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else want to take on any of these other questions? They're written down in the chat too, in case anyone needs a refresher.
Yes, I will say a few things. First, to add to Simeon's response to your question, Claire, which was a really great question, is to sort of keep in mind that when we talk about the local, in a context like Sierra Leone, that local has been largely shaped by the experience of colonialism, right? So, for instance, when you talk about traditional authorities in this context, you have to keep in mind that a lot of what we have is a recreation or reproduction of colonial governance, right? So, I mean, one of the dangers or one of the undermining effects of that relationship, and we see it to date, is that those systems and those structures, they have largely moved away from the people or the sort of legitimacy and accountability structures that pre-colonial societies in Africa used to have. So people like Mahmoud Mamdani have written about this, which is that, in fact, many of the traditional authorities that preside over structures in the local area, they are answerable to the central government and to their people, right? So it means, to your point, that we should not romanticize the local. The local, it has its own potential. Of course, one of the potential, and I think Simeon could relate to this, is that it tends to give women like some form of accessibility that the formal is struggling with. And this has to do with things like the ready availability of informal structures in their communities, right? So when I was doing my research in Sierra Leone and Liberia, many of my respondents I spoke to, they were sort of bringing to my attention the possibility that you can go to your local chief or your subsection or your section chief, even at the middle of night, to knock on their door that you have an issue, and they will open the door and they will listen to you. While in the formal system, there are all these formal protocols, these formal processes you have to go through. So for instance, in terms of the language used in the formal courts, in many cases, it is English for a society that is largely illiterate, particularly in the rural areas. But I agree with Simeon that I think for many people, they are trying to see, depending on their circumstances, which forum is suitable for them. And we should, I think it would be dangerous for us to normatively sort of choose one system or one forum over the other. I think that should be left in the hands of people based on their circumstances. To Caitlin's question, I think I would want our colleagues in Freetown to sort of respond to this, the replacement of the Minister of Lands recently in the country. I am cautiously optimistic that it will mean that a lot is going to change, because I think it takes more than changing an individual to change the practices, the structures that are well entrenched in land management and governance, particularly in Freetown. But I think the only part that I am a little bit sort of hopeful about, I think probably the sacking of the minister is a response to sort of the increasing outcry in Freetown in terms of the mismanagement of land issues in the country. I don't know the extent to which that will go in terms of maybe legislative and policy change, and whether they will keep the momentum, or whether it is probably just a show that the government is doing something. But I guess our friends in Freetown will speak more to this. And to Laura's question about what can be drawn from the experience of Ebola, I think it's a very good comparison, because like Simeon mentioned, it is the closest we can go in trying to look at the relationship between pandemic situation and maybe post-pandemic reform. I think for me, for one thing, is that with these kind of outbreaks, it brings to the fore the challenges that relates to land. So I am going to believe that as we saw in post-Ebola, in post-COVID, the government would want to have control over land, majority of which are in the rural areas, for economic recovery. The question is, how do they balance that with the rights of women, the rights of local communities, and how local communities are able to position themselves? The good news is that also it is within this space that we see a lot of civil society activism, right? The work of Team Up for Justice, women's group, because this becomes a challenge that is at the fore, that is at the center of what's going on in these local communities. So I think we're going to see an increasing advocacy, right? Even though we want economic development, there will be some call for greater protection and maybe reform of the land policy and maybe some legislations down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in and answer any of those questions, or should we?
I mean, I just wanted to, on the second part of Laura's question about, whether there are implications from the 2019 gender amendments. So I mean, there would be implications. So there are implications already on the 2019. I think if you're looking at what we are trying to do, I can see some parallels, right? So the 2019 amendment, that's the Sexual Offences Amendment Act, basically did maybe three things. It increased the sentences of sexual offenders. It created new offenses, including offenses of, trying to settle. So, settling. So what I think especially that one does is it shows the willingness of government to take action on certain issues, even if that means disrupting local power, like local power balance. So in this case, the 2019 amendment basically created some sort of an obligation on chiefs and local authorities not to handle sexual offenses cases at all. And this is a tall order, considering that for the majority of Sierra Leoneans, especially women, they live in communities where there are no police stations, there are no official courts, there's nothing. So if you tell them, if you have a sexual offense complaint, go to the police station or go to the formal court, you're basically saying, do not report it. Because who gives them the money to travel 20 miles to go to a police station? But government doesn't think like that. So the fact that government hasn't thought that through and instead has just moved with the wind to say, well, local authorities do not even talk to people because if you adjudicate, you are going to prison without considering the social consequences. I would think that, that would be like an indication of how at least this government thinks. So, that would tie to the conversation about the minister. I think it's good news, but I want to be slightly cynical, only because there are a raft of cases in court, like several cases in court against the minister and against the government. And there was an order from the parliament for the minister to appear in court the Monday before he was sacked. So the fact that he was sacked just very close to when he was to appear before parliament, when he was to appear before the courts, for me would mean that they just wanted to take the hit off him and the hit of government. So I like to be cynical until I see actual, meaningful action. I guess that would be my response.
I mean, just just a quick one. I think I'll toe in Simeon's line as well, that I'll be very cynical about it. And as Mohammed rightly said, like any practical kind of change or significant change within that ministry, we take a system kind of approach and not just changing one individual who was heading it. I mean, again, the guy who replaced him, Turat Senesi, was part of the same government. He was just removed from a ministry that was failing in its own. So, I mean, it's a totally different ministry, but it's just the same kind of people being rotated around and who have been ineffective in one area they were functioning earlier on. So I'll also be very, 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 very cynical about any kind of tangible changes taking place. But we can still be hopeful. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Patricia, would you like to respond to any of those questions? Sorry, I think you're on mute. There you go.
If I may come in, I want to talk briefly about the land grabbing in Freetown, especially the replacement of the former Minister of Lands. Before this time, there have been many issues of land grabbing, especially for people living in cities. This has been a growing concern over the years, and people have lost most of their lands to the government because the minister take most of this land. Like people don't have claiming people don't have the document, they don't have the papers to these lands, and some people, they are silent, they cannot defend themselves to the system, so they find a lot of these issues,
Uh-oh, I think we might have lost Patricia. Oh, no, I think you're just on mute again, Patricia. Yeah, that mute button. The bane of 2020.
And now people like I was saying, people are optimistic now to what the future holds for them in terms of land grabbing with the new replacement, and they're optimistic, like maybe their voices will be heard in terms of their access to the land which have been taken away from them. They're optimistic that there will be solutions in which they could have back their land. So presently, in this situation, those who own these lands are optimistic, like the future or the present still holds a better one for them.
Thank you so much. I think now, unless anybody has anything last to say on those, maybe we can move on to another question in the chat. All right. So Jillian who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota, is asking about knowledge dissemination. So she's curious if you're looking at knowledge construction and how younger generations learn about gender justice and the land tenure system, and whether you see these younger generations as a solution. anyone like to take that one on?
Yeah, I want to come in a bit. Yeah, to answer to that question, the young generation presently in the country are worried about gender justice, because there are a lot of issues ongoing in the country in which, considering the traditional or customary laws and the formal laws, you may find out that in the higher system, like in the urban areas, people are able like to bring out their issues in the legal system through some organizations, and they are being addressed. But when you look at the local level, you find out that due to some traditions and customs, people find it very difficult to address some of these issues, especially for the youths, the younger generations coming up, since they find it difficult at the local level, they are worried about what the future may hold for us if at this time such issues at the local levels are not being addressed due to some traditions and customs. What does the future really holds for us? So it's like it's gonna be a two-way process, looking at the formal level in the urban areas, and then we have to also look at the local level, how we can help the youths coming up to have their rights to access to land in the future.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Anyone else like to jump in?
Yeah. Okay. No, so I was going to say that, if you look at some of the things we are suggesting, as ways of disseminating information, we are hoping to target a wide swathe of, the Sierra Leonean public. So, and that would include not just policymakers who in Sierra Leone are mostly older men. I mean, you have, some young and some women, but mostly older men, or traditional leaders who also are older. But one of the things we'd like to do through the other methods we are looking at, for example, community dialogue meetings, mobile clinics, village shows, drama, cultural performances, is to be able to engage with other categories or other of the population. And here we're looking at young people, we're looking at women, we're looking at different demographics. Specifically in terms of young people, there are at the moment, we're thinking about having like the student debate series and panel discussions, and this will target young college students, university students, and we're trying to do this in many different places. But we also, people are really interested in radio jingles, in soap opera, especially drama. So there is not a, so part of what we're trying to do is basically look at different ways of targeting different parts of our population. And mostly this will be young people. And yes, I guess just finally, we are not developing all of these things ourselves. So, we will not be doing like the drama. So part of what we want to do will be working with youth groups, and that's part of the connections I was talking about, part of the alliances, the associations, the connections we already have. So work with those groups to develop the kinds of materials and messaging that, their kind would listen to. So yeah, so it's really open. We want to be as innovative as possible and go far beyond just academic output and really deal with, be able to share share the output of this project with the communities themselves. And this means everyone else.
Just to add something to that, thank you for your question, and Gillian. I think for us, it is also about placing engagement with youth within a historical perspective or a historical context. I think Sierra Leone is one country in which you can safely generalize that there is an intergenerational tension, right? Even during the days of the conflict, there are some accounts that it was a conflict that took the form of the unhappiness of the younger population in terms of how they have been dealt with by the older population. And I think I would also add that most of the traditional structures, and here I'm using the word traditional not to just talk about the customary, but that means structures that have been in the country for a very long time since colonial rule. I think I would argue, and I think this is from this perspective, our project is engaging the youth, that those structures have benefited disproportionately older men, right? The older generation. And I think where the appetite is to reform, or in fact to dismantle some of these structures, is in the younger population, including women, right? Because I think there is a greater potential for them if these structures are reformed, if these structures are challenged. And of course, the resistance is coming mainly from the older men, right? But I mean, like Simeon said, we are trying to engage almost all segments of the population, because of course, if you don't engage the older men, the policy community, you will face the kind of resistance and backlash, right, when you are trying to do something constructive. But clearly, to your point, Gillian, yes, the younger population, youth, they are fundamental part of not just knowledge dissemination, as Simeon said, but knowledge construction, right? We are implementing this project with them. So we have this continuous engagement, dialogue with them through student debate and other kind of forum, so that we can give them a voice as the project unfolds. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we've got a couple more questions here that we can, I think we still have time for. So we have one question from Josephine Akiri from Makerere University, who is asking if you could speak a little bit more about the points of comparison with Uganda and the added value in this comparison, and to speak maybe specifically about how gender justice is layered into all of this. And then after that, we have a question from Nikki Armstrong. Based on what has just been said about youth engagement, how much awareness is there by the community about the dual land tenure system and the inequalities that it's causing between Freetown and the other provinces? Is this something that is talked about a lot or covered in the media, or is raising awareness of this and its gendered impacts among the communities also part of the challenge? And we have one last question from Julia from LSE, who is wondering, how can older women be allies in this process of change? So those are three questions. There's in the chat if you guys need to reference them, but would love to hear what you have to say.
Let me just take on Nikki's question really quick. I mean, Simeon or Mohammed, feel free to jump in at some point, but just this is anecdotal, really, based on my experiences and things like that. I think these are things you end up learning about organically, like growing up and over time when you become an adult and you're thinking about, oh, probably I want to have build a house, let me get a land and something, and yeah, you end up learning about this. Except if you're someone like Simeon or Mohammed, who had to study about Sierra Leone's history and political context and all the legal framework that supports land tenure systems and land rights and access. So you'll be able to learn that as well. So, however, I mean, in more recent times, there has been a lot of discourse around this. If you listened earlier to Simeon's presentation about the legal framework and how that has evolved over time. And of course, Mohammed's historical context, particularly when it comes to the post-conflict Sierra Leone and how that led into some political boom. Of course, access to land became a huge discourse, and it still becomes a major part of our development discourse currently. But yes, I agree there. It still forms like advocacy and raising awareness on land rights and its gender implications is still a challenge and it's still a need. And that's part of the reason why we have this project. And one of those things we want to be able to address, particularly within this context. So yeah, I mean, that's just it.
I would jump in to, let me start with Josephine's question. Thanks for the question, Josephine. Of course, one of the things that we want to do in our project is to conduct a comparative empirical analysis with the situation in Uganda. So your question was what we are considering to be the added value of this comparative approach. Well, I think from some of the background information we've been able to collect or research we've been able to do is that there are some justification for a comparative analysis based on the history of both countries, right? These are countries that are both sort of British and former British colonies. We see the various layers that Simeon and I have spoken about in terms of the duality, but also in terms of the plurality of customary systems in these countries. So I think one added value that we will get is that, I mean, probably you would know about this. There's this tendency to talk about Africa as a single country, right? Sort of disregarding the variation that are within the continent. So I think one thing that we would like to explore is that despite this sort of comparable historical and political context, in terms of outcomes, in terms of the real life experiences of women and people, are there any differences and what explains that, right? So we will be interested in, for instance, the way rural women in Uganda talk about their experiences in accessing justice within these systems, and those in Sierra Leone, right? Not just looking at how they are comparable, but whether there are any distinctions and what explains that. And one thing that we're also very much interested in is that while Sierra Leone seems to represent, right, the typical duality of tenure systems, it seems to us from our preliminary research that in Uganda, within the customary system, you have a greater plurality there, right? You have probably a greater differentiation in terms of what operates in one region than the other, right? So we will be trying to explore, even within customary frameworks, what differences are there and how they have evolved over time. But I think the most important point is that we are trying to see whether there is any distinction between the way these issues are experienced in the East African sub-region and in West Africa, even though we are coming from the same historical and political history. And so that's what I want to say about that. And to the question that was posed to me about engaging older women, it's a good one because, of course, our research is particularly focused, right, on the experiences of women when it comes to access to land and property rights. And of course, older women, particularly women-headed household, they are a key component. In fact, we are going to make sure that women, particularly women in this category, equally participate in this project. And they are not waiting for us, actually, to do something about their situation. There are women groups, right? In many communities in Sierra Leone, Simeon's organization have been working with them. So we're going to engage them, right, to know what they are doing and how the research can contribute to them. I think one thing we don't want to do in this project is to impose our own solution, right, on those people. It's to build, it's to learn from them what they are doing about accessing land. So for instance, women in most local communities in Sierra Leone, they have their own women's group, even secret societies, right? And within those forums, they are able to exchange, they're able to share their problems and look for solutions. So definitely it's going to be an engagement with this category of women, because clearly they are at the fore when you talk about the challenges that women, particularly in families. Simeon mentioned the sort of Devolution of Estate Act, right? We're going to follow that act in terms of its implementation. And I think most of the women who are affected by that act, they are older women, right? Women who want to get access to property that they got in their family. Some of them may have lost their husband and they are trying to get access to their property. One last thing I will say about whether the young population has knowledge about the duality and the tension within Sierra Leone, both in the legal system, but specifically in terms of land tenure. I echo what Anthony has said. I think we need to do more in trying to bring a subject like this into the curriculum of educational institutions in the country, right? It is often based on your personal family experience that you know about this issue. I did not learn about it when I was in my high school. It's only for people who are specializing in these areas that get this knowledge. So I think we will try to see how to sort of include something like this in the school curriculum, but all that sort of outside school ways of generating knowledge in the country. And that explains the multiplicity of knowledge dissemination we have in our project. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to maybe just add a bit to that by saying, so if you're looking at a category like older women, what our project would show is, just how complicated it is. So it's one country, it's, tiny, less than 7 million people, less than 28,000 square miles. But as a result of all of the things we've spoken about, the legal dualism, different rules, it means if you take older women from the Western area, for example, this would be Creoles, right? They would be the most powerful. So they might be 2%, 3% of the population, but they're the most powerful in the sense that they are well educated, like super, super educated. You'll find them in all of the big professional positions, right? They'll be the doctors, the lawyers, the judges, the engineers. They are powerful, but they are older women. So, you can't lump them with, I guess, all the women in the provinces who probably have never been to school at all, because there is this huge disparity in Sierra Leone as a result of our history, where you've had schools in Freetown since the 1812s, 1845. So you have like generations of educated people in one part of the country, and then in the other half of the country, you didn't have a school until 1950s. So in a way, you have to think about that. But I guess what that even tells us is, everybody, as a result of just the history of the country, every group or every category has its own specific problems with the system. So if you talk about people in the Western area, their problem is, why can't we own land in the 98% of the country? Why can everyone else in the country own land in our 2%, but we can't own land in the 98%? So why can a foreigner, for example, who is not a Sierra Leonean, own land somewhere in the 98%, but as a Sierra Leonean who is part of the 2%, I can't own land, right? So that's their problem. And why am I mentioning this? Because 5 years ago, a group of lawyers who are all from the 2% brought this case to the Supreme Court, right? So fortunately, it has not been ruled on yet, because the other lawyers in the Bar Association have objected, basically to say, look, the judges are from the 2%. You're all from the 2%, so you have an invested interest in judging in your favor. Now, this is important because what the project wants to do is to be able to highlight these different issues for different categories. So we can say older women, younger women, we can say youths versus old people, but it would all still depend on where they are coming from, or where they are staying, or where they are living. So, this then means we don't really have homogeneous groups, so even if the categories are. And so part of our challenge, and this is why the comparison with Uganda becomes even more important, we want to be able to see, even within monolithic groups like, say, if you just say Sierra Leone as a country, how heterogeneous it is, right? How many categories you can build and how many subcategories you can even get from there, and make the contrast or comparison useful.
Thank you. All right, we have Patricia. Would you like to answer any of those questions, or should we move on to the other two? Other two questions, that is. let's move on to the other two, and then whoever can jump in. So Laura Martin has a follow-up question about older women. Mention of older women made her think, to what extent do secret societies, particularly female, have the capacity to maintain or resist access to land? And then Mary Claire Ferre from UK WILPF has asked, what about existing religious texts and ideologies which have reinforced patriarchal post-colonial customs? Faith is really a central issue in many communities. So there's those two questions to consider as well. And then maybe just in the interest of time, if anybody has any last questions, if you could throw them up in the chat, that would be great.
I mean, Laura, I can just take a stab at Laura's question, and Mohammed and the others, please feel free to add. So as I explained, just the categories of, so even when you talk about women, they're really so different. So the idea of secret societies makes my point even, I guess, reinforces the point I was making. So you can't find secret societies in the Western area, in the 2%, because this was basically a British territory to say, right? But you can find secret societies in the rest of the country, and these are very powerful institutions. So for outsiders, people who probably haven't really studied Sierra Leone that well, or haven't really lived in the provinces that well, they will underestimate or even underrate the power of secret societies. For those of us who grew up there, you really know how powerful they are. And I always say that's the one area where women maintain absolute authority. If you like absolute authority, that's the one space they have where they are more powerful than men. And they are so powerful that they can set up their own rules. They can set up, whatever they want to do, and nobody will question them. So in terms of land, land that belongs to a female secret society, or land that is claimed by a female secret society, cannot be touched. It doesn't really matter who. So even if you're the most powerful traditional leader, you can't even go close to it. That's how powerful they are. So the problem is they don't do so to many other lands, right? So that means there is so much more land that women can be deprived from. But in terms of what power or authority they have, secret societies do provide a space, which is why many of us are advocating against, we are basically advocating against people just talking about generally abolishing, secret societies. Like we're saying, there are things about secret societies that are, bad enough that would need to change. But if you attack the institution, there are many other things you might lose. You might lose that authority to land. You might lose many other things. So for example, secret societies in villages can give a rule to say, for the next 1 month, no woman should be beaten or no woman should be abused. And if you do so, even if you're a male chief, you would be tied up by the women and publicly flogged. There are sanctions, so you wouldn't do it. So I'm saying, so I guess my point here, Laura, is older women are part of the secret societies, yes, but you also have younger women. Secret societies do create some space for women to resist land grabbing, and encourage more access to land. But the space isn't that much as compared to the rest of the property that we really have and the rest of other situations where people can get land. And I guess the quick one on Marie Claire, religion in Sierra Leone is such an interesting component. If there is a place where there is almost total freedom of religion, Sierra Leone will be the place where, religion is almost accepted as a way of life. But how it relates to land, it's patriarchal. So, that does play into male roles. But, that in turn doesn't mean as a religious leader that gives you any authority to, get more land or so I would say you would find religion playing a role, but it would be mostly in the role in how religion and custom get, merged together so that you can hardly disentangle them. So, you'll have religious leaders who are also customary leaders, And it's in their role as customary leaders that they are able to sneak in their religious beliefs.
A couple of additions to what Simeon has said. To the question about secret society, I think my response and Simeon's response clearly shows that Simeon is a lawyer and I'm a political scientist. Because I mean, Simeon, using his law heart, has said that there are secret societies do not exist in Freetown. But for me, I see secret society not through the legal lens, right? Because many of the rural residents that have moved to Freetown, they have been able to practice, right, their secret society institutions and organizations, even though it is not legally recognized, right? So I think that is to say that some of the good things, I also agree with Simeon that there are aspects of civil society that need to be reformed. But some of the good things like solidarity among women, right? Using their power to advocate for other women, I think it is something that we could also see in the Western area, in Freetown. Because when people move to Freetown, they do not always leave behind their tradition, their practices. They sometimes come with it, even though it will evolve, it will respond to the change in context, but it does not completely go away. So I just wanted to add that. And the other thing that I wanted to add, I think in terms of the power of civil society for women, even in the rural areas, we have to make a kind of a northeast and southeast distinction. And that has to do with the institution of chieftaincy, right? In the northeast, chieftaincy is more traditionally oriented and male dominated. It provides very little room for women to, for instance, become a paramount chief. But in the southeast, we have cases of women who are paramount chief. And I think that if you have a woman paramount chief, I think it creates a greater space for women's secret society, right, to be able to participate, right, in public decision in those processes that relate to land, because there is an alignment of power, right? Power of the women as paramount at the paramount chieftaincy level, and power of women in their secret societies. On religion, 2 points, again, to re-echo what Simeon has said. There is the negative side, right, which is how religion, both Christianity and Islam, may reinforce patriarchal structures and order within the family, for instance, right? This idea that the man is the head of the family and should have the say when it comes to land, when it comes to distribution of property. I think there are some religious texts that reinforces that relationship. So there is no way you can be able to sort of bring down those structures if you don't pay attention to what religion is doing. On the positive side, though, I think religion also provides, outside the legal system, a forum to resolve land dispute, right? So, for instance, I think there are some religious authorities, there are some pastors, some imams, some head of religious organizations that will create forum for people to hear their grievances as it relates to land, and to try to resolve them before it becomes very bad, or even before it reaches the formal system. So to me, that could be a good thing that religious organizations and institutions are doing in Sierra Leone. Thank you.
Patricia, I think you're on mute. If you're
okay,
there we go.
I just want to add some points to what Mohammed and Simeon have said. In Sierra Leone, when it comes to land, women's rights in terms of secret societies, this is the only place we can say women have absolute control over, because some of these lands, I can say, they are sacred. And in the event in which these lands want to be used, like say for development, there has to be a lot of negotiation between the people and the women who own this land, because these, like I said, these are sacred places. And this is the only place where women have access to and have rights to. So in situation like this is the only situation in which women have a lot of engagement, a lot of negotiation. In the event, even if they have to relinquish this land saying for development, there has to be a lot of negotiation because there are a lot of customary rights they have to do in order to like relinquish this land for development. So these in this case, women have total control over this kind of lands in Sierra Leone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I think that's all in terms of our questions. Thank you for those really amazing presentations and thoughtful answers. I learned so much. I think it's fascinating how sort of in different ways all of you touched on these different spaces where power is operating and different opportunities and challenges that poses, both in terms of land tenure issues, but also exercising rights and justice spaces. So if any of the panelists would like to have some closing remarks, this would be the time to do so. Anybody? Any closing thoughts or reflections? If not, that's fine. We can.
Sure, I can say
Sure.
something.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Which is to once again thank everybody for their time to come to our session. It would not have been a success without your coming and your participation. We appreciate your questions, and I mean, one thing we would promise is that this conversation is something that we're going to feed into our revision of what we want to do, because we are still reflecting on our project, and clearly we did not provide you all the answers you were looking for. Is because we've not at the moment conducted the research itself, right? We are still at the preliminary stage. We should have done most of this work by now, but with COVID, we had to put up with a lot of postponement of our event. But we are at a point where we're going to move forward. We're going to definitely do some field work this summer. In fact, we're going to start in February. And so stay tuned. We are hoping to bring you more findings and more results in the months and in the years to come. Thank you once again for showing up and for your wonderful questions.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. Yeah, I agree with everyone. It'd be great to hear how your research plans evolve, and I'm really excited to hear how things shape up. Becca has told me to remind everybody that the final public event for the convention discussing gender and peace studies in Colombia is taking place at 1300 hours GMT on the 29th of January. It will be in Spanish, but English translation will be available, and we'll include and the link is in the chat. So once again, thanks so much to our amazing panelists, and take care, everybody, and be in touch.